Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are wading into some pretty contentious waters. We're talking about the aesthetics and really the philosophy of fan fiction.
We are, and the sources we're looking at today make some truly sweeping claims about where modern storytelling has gone.
And when you say sweeping, you mean heist. The central mission for this deep dive is to unpack this assertion from our source material that the aesthetic of modern fan fiction has, and I'm quoting here, broken internet containment.
Exactly, and that it's now directly responsible for what they call the severe degradation of modern literature and, well, even culture itself.
Okay, so let's get into that right away. We have to be impartial here. And we should say right at the top, the medium itself is neutral. Good fan fiction, well-written stuff, it absolutely...
Oh, for sure. This analysis isn't about that. It's focused squarely on the majority aesthetic, the norm, right, the philosophy, and the specific desires that really dominate the most popular corners of these online communities.
That's a crucial distinction.
It is. Because when most people hear the word fan fiction, they get a very specific mental image, right? It doesn't matter if they've read it or not.
Yeah, there's a definite consensus image.
Right. And our source says we have to look past our personal taste and see the measurable influence of this specific philosophy that's emerged. They even give it a name, fanfictionism.
Fanfictionism. Okay, so what are the tenets of that? It sounds like it's more than just, bad writing.
Oh, it's much more. It's a philosophy that really elevates subjectivism. Its main tenets are, 1, prioritizing emotional release and gratification over actual craft.
Okay.
2, embracing total creative permissive. And 3, a dedication to these very specific community-driven rules, like the rigid tagging systems and content warnings over, say, universal literary standards.
Seems like plot structure.
Or objective narrative.
Exactly. Fundamentally changes the entire contract between the writer, the reader, and the story itself. And this is where the sources drop a truly staggering claim. They argue that fan fiction is responsible for something like 80 to 90% of the degradation we see in modern literature today.
An incredible number.
Yeah.
And they point to one single catalytic event for it all, the unprecedented way the Harry Potter series collided with the fan fiction medium.
Right. And to be clear, this isn't a critique of J.K. Rowling's writing.
Not at all. It's about the unique sociological timing of it. I mean, think about the sheer length and scope of that series.
It went on for, what, a decade?
Over a decade. It started as children's books, which meant an entire generation literally grew up alongside those characters. They started reading in elementary school and were finishing the series when they were in college.
That kind of sustained immersion over that long of a period is pretty much unheard of. It creates a profound emotional impact.
Profound is the right word. And that depth of attachment, it completely transformed the idea of shipping.
Shipping, for anyone who doesn't know, is rooting for two characters to get into a relationship.
Right. But it moved from this niche fan concept into a global cultural reality. It was fueled by a generation that really felt like these characters were their friends, their family.
So it wasn't just hoping the author would get two characters together anymore.
No, it became something much more powerful. Fans started to believe that these characters are together, or at least should be together, no matter what the actual published story said. The fans' emotional investment just tossed. It completely superseded the author's creative control.
The Harry Potter era was the launch of 1,000.
It was. And this meant fan fiction wasn't just some private hobby on the margins anymore. The sources argue that this confluence of factors meant it was suddenly making tangible, measurable contributions to the shape of literature and culture.
With massive negative consequence, according to analysis.
The containment had broken. And the lineage, they argue, is incredibly clear. If you look at the general decline in YA literature mid-2000s, the source ties it directly to the aesthetics that fan fiction injected into the mainstream.
The market just shifted. It started prioritizing these trope-heavy, immediate emotional hits over, nuanced plotting.
And we can trace the direct offspring of this. The first huge one was Twilight.
Right. Twilight fundamentally changed the YA market. It popularized that morally gray, anti-hero romantic lead and, created huge demographic shifts in who was buying books.
And it was originally a piece of Harry Potter fan fiction.
That's the first huge step.
The second, and you could argue it was even more culturally devastating, was E.L. James's 50 Shades of Grey.
A primary catalyst for what the source calls the smut apocalypse.
It absolutely is. It's a phenomenon that continues to dominate publishing today, blurring genre lines and basically establishing that maximum explicit content is a viable, even successful sales strategy.
And famously, 50 Shades started out as Twilight fanfiction.
Exactly. So you have this clear evolutionary chain. Harry Potter fanfiction gives birth to Twilight, and then Twilight fanfiction gives birth to 50 Shades.
And the list of commercially successful books that started this way just goes on and on. It really proved that the aesthetics and the demands of that fan community they rapidly cycle into mainstream commercial fiction.
Changing everything. But the key takeaway here, the issue that underpins all of this, isn't fan fiction itself. It's the core aesthetic philosophy it promotes, self-indulgence.
And that brings us to the first major conceptual problem our sources identify. This pervasive epidemic of self-indulgence and self-representation in modern story. This is really the root cause for everything else.
It is. And we need to define self-indulgence in a very specific literary context. It has nothing to do with genre or style.
So what is it?
It's the practice of prioritizing the writer's immediate emotional needs, their fantasies, their desires, prioritizing all of that over the story's structural needs or the integrity of the characters or just objective literary quality.
It's choosing pleasure over difficulty.
And a fundamental avoidance of restraint.
Yes.
It's almost like the difference between writing that demands something of you and writing that just serves as personal therapy.
That's a great way to...
For the self-indulgent writer, the writing process is mainly a vehicle for their own gratification. If a story element makes them uncomfortable or anxious or challenges their worldview, they just take it out.
Whereas a more, say, artistically committed writer will often do the opposite. They'll set aside their own comfort for the good of the story, even if it makes them or the reader deeply uncomfortable.
And we can see this self-indulgence manifest in some really concrete, often kind of bizarre ways in mainstream storytelling today.
Like the modern villain.
The safe villain, yes. The self-indulgent aesthetic demands villains that aren't allowed to be, quote, the wrong kind of disturbing.
Meaning anything that's genuinely offensive to our current social sensibilities?
Right. And this compromises the narrative in a couple of ways. First, you're sanitizing the villain's evil. And second, you're forcing the author to insert these totally anachronistic moral codes into the story.
Can you give us an example of how that balancing act fails?
Sure. The source often points to this trope where you have a genocidal maniac, a character who is, evil enough for the high stakes of the plot, but who also has to be sensitive to modern social issues to satisfy the writer's emotional needs.
So you get what? A high fantasy warlord who commits mass murder but is really good about his minions' pronouns.
That is the exact example. Or a villain who would never, ever use a racial slur. The moment you introduce that layer of moral hygiene, you completely sacrifice the narrative authority of the threat. The villain just becomes a vehicle for modern commentary.
And their motivations feel thin.
Completely. And this behavior extends into every dialogue, period accuracy. Self-indulgence means you get heroes living in, say, 13th century England who suddenly start having these long, drawn-out conversations about current year political issues.
Issues that have no bearing on their world at all.
None. The narrative purpose is just sacrifice for the writer's need to express or validate their own modern sensibilities.
And the same logic gets applied to historical representation, which the source is very...
Absolutely. The source argues that ignoring period accuracy just becomes standard practice when the writer is prioritizing self-representation. They critique this tendency to, say, insert a large number of people of African descent into a story set in 11th century Scotland.
Without any reasonable in-world explanation for it.
Right. Or non-period accurate ethnicities into the ruling classes of Georgian Britain. The source asserts this choice is driven exclusively by the writer's need for personal emotional validation. It's about feeding their own fantasy.
So the critique isn't about representation itself, but the motivation behind the judgment that it's often a self-feeding mechanism that ignores historical reality.
Precisely. The core problem is always the same. The writer becomes the subject of the story. Self-indulgence just inevitably drives writers to insert themselves into their own narrative.
Usually as the main character.
And this isn't seen as a flaw anymore. The source argues it's now actively encouraged. Writing is approached, narcissistically, as a tool for self-validation, not as an art.
This brings us to a quote from the source that really stands out. It's from Fran Liss, who said that a book is not supposed to be a mirror, it's supposed to door.
And the source really holds that up as the definitive statement on what fiction should be. Its function isn't to see yourself perfectly reflected back. It's to explore other people, different ideas, challenging circumstances.
It's supposed to broaden your perspective, not just force.
But the fan fiction environment is structured to do the exact opposite. It fosters this mirror mentality. It trains both the reader and the writer to seek validation above everything else.
Through these kinds of unwritten rules.
Yes. There's this strange, soft rule in fan fiction communities that you can't write what you... And this extends to writing about complex experiences like disabilities or specific sexual orientation. It leads to genuine public outrage when a non-marginalized writer even tries.
That seems like a total collapse of imaginative empathy. I mean, if a writer can't imagine the experience of others, what is the point of fiction?
Well, the function becomes about identity politics and self-representation. And what's more, the medium itself actively programs the reader's mind for self-insertion.
You're talking about the second-person point of view.
Exactly. The classic self-insert avatar genre. These stories are explicitly built so the main relationship, the ship, is a canon character, plus the reader.
They use the pronoun you.
Right. You walk into the room and the hero looks up and says, it trains the emotional mind to just instantly map yourself onto the protagonist.
So if a reader is trained, almost like a Pavlovian response, to always see the main character as a reflection of themselves, it's inevitable that when they start writing, their own characters will be
And we see the mainstream consequences of this everywhere. Authors giving their heroines the exact same obscure medical condition they have. Video game creators changing character models to look just like them. It feels natural to them because that's how fan fiction taught them storytelling worked.
This all leads to this crucial conflict over creative integrity, right? This constant battle at the writer's desk between self-indulgence and creative honesty.
It does. And the source holds up Cormac McCarthy as the gold standard for rejecting self-indulgence.
How so?
Well, his writing process, especially for a book like Blood Meridian, is incredibly instructive. He was famous for going through his early drafts and specifically removing any scene that was too emotional or offered a glimmer of kindness or moral relief for his character.
So he would actively make the books darker and more difficult.
He cut scenes because keeping them would have indulged his own comfort, his own desire to maybe like his characters a little or soften the blow for the reader. He chose the story's brutal necessity over his own subjective.
That's the ultimate choice of the story over the writer's person.
Contrast that with fanfic, which actively commodifies serving those personal emotions. Anything uncomfortable, anything that prevents total reader identification or emotional relief. It's seen not just as a bad narrative choice, but as morally and creatively wrong.
And now we're seeing this aesthetic dictate terms to major publishers, books being pulled or rewritten because something in them is deemed uncomfortable.
The Sparrow and Vine case is a perfect example. That book was pulled before it was even released because some early readers were outraged that a flawed character admired a controversial businessman's strategies.
Just admired them, not, endorsed genocide or anything. A character flaw.
A character flaw. And that was enough. It disrupted the reader's emotional comfort, so it had to be purged. The author ultimately rewrote passages so they, quote, wouldn't contribute to harm.
That is the fan fiction mentality asserting its dominance. The text has to prioritize the reader's emotional safety above all else.
And that demand explains the explosion of these incredibly granular content tags and trigger warning, not just for violence, but for things like vomiting, food, eye horror, or mild grief. They function as pre-filters to guarantee a safe, customized, emotionally insulated experience.
That need for hyper-specific emotional gratification leads us right in second the smut epoch and this pursuit of emotional release that goes way beyond just sexual.
Right. The reputation of fan fiction is profoundly sexual. The source uses an analogy to OnlyFans, saying that even if, say, 80% of the content strictly explicit smut, the overall reputation and the main draw is rooted in sexual gratification.
And it links back to that core function we talked about, shipping. That's the fundamental driver, making it intrinsically romantic and almost always sexual.
Yeah, you combine that romantic core with the philosophy of total self-indulgence, and you couple that with what the source calls the extremely permissive and shame-averse nature of modern society.
Yeah.
That you create the perfect.
The result being young writers indulging every single sexual fantasy imaginable.
From simple romance scenes to, frankly, deeply disturbing stories of torture and abuse that still get millions.
And crucially, that success model translated direct commercial public.
Oh, absolutely. The law of the fan fiction jungle, as the source calls it, dictates that maximum explicit content often equals maximum sale. Many of today's best-selling romance and romantasy authors, they came up in fan fiction. They just applied that law to their original work.
If you want the easy road to sales, pack in the high stakes, explicit content, and the readers trained by this aesthetic will come running.
But what's really insightful here is the argument that this self-indulgence extends beyond sex into what they term emotional smut.
So what's emotional smut?
It's content where the sole function is to provide maximum, highly specific emotional satisfaction for the reader. It's gratification that relies on intense emotional resonance, not just physical relief.
And you can see evidence of this in the architecture of the sites themselves. The tag system on Archive Our Own, AO3, it's not just for organization, it's a demand signal.
Exactly. It's for finding hyper-specific content to satisfy hyper-specific emotional need. It lets a reader pre-filter their experience to guarantee immediate comfort or release. You just have to look at the popular emotional tags: hug, happy ending, comfort, cuddling and snuggling.
Praise kink, protectiveness, self-esteem.
Yeah.
These are all tags directly satisfying an emotional.
And they often get intertwined with self-representation tags like autism spectrum or LGBTQ or just a simple reader insert to make sure that emotional gratification is mapped right back onto the reader's own identity.
This focus on specific emotional demand leads us to this bizarre phenomenon known as wump.
Wump. Yes, which I believe is an old onomatopoeia for a comic book body.
Okay, but here it's used as a term for emotionally or sexually satisfying physical harm done to a character. That sounds deeply uncomfortable.
Well, the source clarifies the psychology behind it. They argue it's less about sadism and more about the intense emotional release that comes from the physical harm, which is then followed by the guaranteed, inevitable promise of comfort.
So it's the hurt-comfort subgenre.
Exactly. The injury is just a prerequisite for getting maximum emotional attention, caregiving, and intimacy from a preferred character. The physical pain is just the trigger for the wish fulfillment.
The level of obsession with control and wish fulfillment it's staggering, and the depth of the community engagement is astonishing.
It really is. The source mentions these public, fan-made, incredibly detailed spreadsheets that focus just on Western media, TV shows, movies, games, with over 15,000 entries dedicated to wump scenes.
15,000?
Yes. With timestamps, descriptions, trigger warnings, it's a catalog of when and how a male character is physically or emotionally injured, all to serve this one specific fan desire.
It's like a scientific cataloging of fictional pain for person. And the common defense for all this is that it's therapeutic.
A defense the source argues against vehemently. While writing itself might be therapeutic for the writer, publishing your therapy session is not a literary act. The goal of literature is to communicate a truth about the world, not just to publish your own self-gratifying emotional release. That is the absolute height of self-indulgence.
Which brings us back to that issue of total permissiveness. Sites like AO3 are built on the philosophy that nothing is forbidden.
And the source notes that this total lack of restraint has led to an escalating factor of transgressive content over time. The argument is stark. The most extreme dark romance you can buy in a bookstore today is, quote, tame as Mary Poppins, compared to the sheer volume of graphic stuff you can find effortlessly on AO3.
Which leads us to the infamous tag, dead dove do not eat.
That tag is the ultimate warning sign. It signals extreme content, inhumane brutality, non-consent, highly transgressive acts, usually intended for sexual or very specific emotional gratification.
And the community defense is just don't read.
Which is technically true, of course. But the source expresses serious structural concern for the mental and ethical state of the people who are not just consuming, but actively creating and celebrating these profoundly disturbing stories.
And the warning is that this content, the most extreme stuff, is slowly making its way into the mainstream.
We're already seeing it. The rise of monster and animal smut book, things like Morning Glory Milking Farm, which started in these fan communities. The source argues this proves the market's appetite for extreme content is insatiable. It's only a matter of time before the most extreme material finds its way onto commercial bookstore shelves.
Okay, we need to dig into a case study that really encapsulates all of this. The phenomenon of boys' love, or BL.
Right. BL is defined as gay romance, almost always explicitly sexual or highly romantic between two male characters. But the crucial, complex dynamic here is that it has a disproportionately huge audience of straight women.
And it started in Japan as fan fiction written by these straight women, the Fujoshi.
Back in the 70s and 80s, yes. And the relationship dynamics are often very strange. You usually have two young, often androgynously beautiful men, but the narrative imposes a strict heterosexual dynamic.
So one character is the submissive half, the Yuke, and the other is the dominant, traditionally masculine Seam.
Yeah, and the source notes that this dominant character often operates without any concern for boundaries or consent. In fact, that's often the main narrative draw.
The lack of consent is the draw.
Frequently, the relationship often begins with sexual violence, even in hugely popular mainstream media. The source cites the popular Thai BL drama Kin Portia, where one male lead sexually assaults the other while he was drugged. And this is portrayed as the catalyst for his gay awakening.
Wow. So there's this self-perpetuating feedback. Gay shipping fan fiction creates BL, which then gets professionalized and marketed globally. And that popular genre, in turn, just feeds the fan fiction hunger for shipping canonical straight male characters.
It's a self-sustaining cycle of exponential growth, especially in the Asian drama market, which is now dominated by Thai BL. And the popularity among Western women who consume this media is enormous.
To the point where the market is totally dominated by it.
Right. The vast majority of Eastern novels that get translated by fans are either explicitly BL, or what fans call BL coded.
Meaning the fans ship the male characters so hard they just interpret the text as romantic, even if it was intended as, deep friendship.
Correct. It's been wryly dubbed BL brain rot by other readers who complain that non-BL novels rarely get translated because the market demand is so singularly focused on this one specific type of gratification.
And this intense emotional investment spills over into the real world.
It does. The source details the fanatical behavior of the fandom, pointing out that some women have been documented stalking their favorite BL act. It confirms that the infatuation is highly personal, deeply sexual, and emotional.
The controversy around the Chinese drama The Untamed is a perfect case study of this, with global
It is. The original novel, The Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, was explicit BL and sometimes featured underage characters. So when China adapted it for TV, they were subject to censorship law. They changed the romance to a platonic, deep friendship.
Which the source says actually made the story less self-indulgent.
Yes, it allowed the plot to focus on the political intrigue and fantasy element. But the fans, trained by this aesthetic of self-insertion and shipping, they just refused to accept it.
They inserted their own desires onto the text.
And onto the actors. They interpreted their interactions as romantic even when they were out of character in interviews. This obsession culminated in the infamous AO3 blocking incident in China in 2020.
Which started with a single piece of fan fiction.
A piece of real-person fiction, or RPF, about the two real actors, Xiaozhan and Wang Yibo. It culminated in a scene where one impregnates a feminized, much younger version of the other, who was working as an underage prostitute.
The nature of that sexually graphic, RPF, underage, it caused widespread shock.
It did. And the uproar led directly to the Chinese government, blocking access to AO3 in the entire country and tightening its laws, making it illegal to write about real people or underage characters in such a way.
Which leads us right to the core ethical problem the source identified. The sheer volume of underage content on these sites and the community's aggressive defense of it.
The statistics are very concerning. On AO3 alone, the source says there are over 360,000 fan fiction stories that feature underage pairing. The most popular one has over 4 million hits.
And many more are probably untagged.
Exactly. And when anyone raises legitimate concerns about the volume of this material, the response is often condemnation. They frame any concern as censorship or fascism.
It's a refusal to engage with the ethical question.
It is, and the source argues that if a community is willing to die on the hill of defending the absolute permissiveness that allows this kind of graphic content, especially involving underage characters, it forces a structural review of what that community is feeding.
And it raises a really challenging question about the real-world implications of this constant indulgence.
It does. The source asks if this constant consumption of content with disturbing consent issues and extreme age gap actually informs attitudes and behavior in young people.
They cautiously connect it to a real-world.
Yes, to the apparent uptick in sexual crimes against young teenage boys being committed by adult women, noting that the statistics for those specific crimes are, in fact, highly alarming.
So the argument is that if the entire function is to satisfy a need for personalized pleasure, and that pleasure is satisfied by transgressive content, the desire to embody that fantasy in reality might eventually follow, especially in a culture with no shame or social consequence attached.
The source leans on studies that suggest what we consume tends to inform our opinions and eventually our behavior. Constant, zero-restraint indulgence in this kind of content is bound to have an ethical impact.
Okay, let's pivot to the final and maybe most lasting consequence, the profound drop in literary quality and the rise of derivatives.
This is where we look at the publishing pipeline itself. A huge percentage of popular new writers today, they came right out of the fan fiction community. This was their literary nursery.
So their entire education in good writing was formed inside insular self-referential echo.
Exactly. They came up on a diet of fan content and what the source calls critical literacy, which is literary criticism filtered through fan community, not a formal study of great literature, history, or philosophy.
And in that community, traditional literary quality like plot structure or good prose or even grammar, it's basically irrelevant to success.
Fundamentally irrelevant. The priorities are entirely different. It's about consumer-driven emotional gratification.
So does the story evoke the right emotions? Does it comfort the reader?
Does it satisfy their demands for the ship? Does it tick all the boxes for popular tastes and niche kinks? Does it have all the right content? Finally, is the writer a non-problematic person?
Those factors are more important than the quality of the writing itself?
Infinitely more. This completely changes the metric for literary achievement. It's not about craft or truth anymore. It's about commerce and catering to a demand.
The complete commodification of emotional satisfaction.
Yes, literary greatness, or at least commercial greatness, is now measured by your ability to satisfy the largest number of readers' highly specific emotional and sexual demands.
And there's a perfect example of this in the fanfiction, All the Young Do.
An extremely popular Harry Potter fanfic that is sometimes called Our Era's War and Peace by the community. The source argues its popularity has nothing to do with literary merit. Its sole function is emotional satisfaction through a popular gay ship, Remus and Sirius.
The writer bypassed the need for true craft by leveraging the reader's pre-existing emotional investment.
And that highlights the core magic of fanfiction, which the source calls the fan service leverage. It's a massive shortcut.
How so?
The fanfiction writer leverages 50 to 70% of the narrative work, world building, character creation, the emotional context from the reader's pre-existing love for the established IP. This allows for a completely engrossing experience without the author having to build anything new from scratch.
Which is the critical problem. When writers trained this way try to write original work, they hit a wall.
A huge structural wall, because they never learned how to create something entirely new. Since fanfiction is inherently derivative, they only know how to leverage existing worlds.
So when they try an original work, the world building feels flat and half-realized.
Because they have no practice building a new cosmos from the ground up, and the same stunted craft applies to their character. They rely on the reader's pre-existing love for canon characters to do the emotional heavy lifting.
So their original characters, except for the heavy self-insert, come across as flat archetypes.
Because they never had to convince an audience to care about Gratch.
And this derivative strategy isn't just in books anymore. It's the dominant strategy for all modern.
It is the ultimate carryover. Professional writers who came up in this environment now apply that same strategy to movies, books, video games. That's why we see this current heavy focus on fan service, sequels, reboots, meta, self-referencing.
They're all literary shortcuts.
All designed to leverage the audience's existing infatuation, rather than daring to produce something original that demands new emotional work from the consumer.
They learned that fan engagement and immediate emotional satisfaction are the ultimate metric set. Why strive for a timeless literary work when you can get instant, massive success by catering to a specific, emotionally hungry demographic?
It's the siren call of easy fame and maximum return for minimum creative investment.
But the source makes it really clear that both readers and writers have a choice here.
The conclusion is a powerful indictment of the consumer's role. The source summarizes the cycle. Fanfiction readers shape the market, fanfiction writers produce the works, and the entire landscape of storytelling gradually takes on the image of fanfiction aesthetic.
So the source offers clear, if, demanding advice.
It's a message of conscious choice. Stop reading fanfiction. Stop writing self-indulgent fanfic. And critically, stop rewarding publishers who rely on these lazy literary shortcuts.
The recommendation is to read better, harder books, to stop feeding the aesthetic monster,
and to deliberately choose the harder, less indulgent path. This isn't about censorship. It's about exercising personal free will and demanding more of yourself as a consumer and a creator.
It's about saying, I want stories with substance and truth, stories that challenge my mind, not just indulge my emotions.
Exactly. The core advice is to reject emotional mediocrity. The source urges you as a listener to demand more from your stories than mere emotional onanism, and to seek betterment through narrative difficulty.
That's a challenging final thought on literary quality. But if we connect this all back to that foundational philosophy of fanfictionism, the absolute permissive, the emotional indulgence, this deep dive has focused on its impact.
Which raises the critical, overarching question that we really have to leave you with. A question that extends far beyond bookstores. If fanfiction thrived by encouraging self-representation and emotional comfort, by creating safe spaces through rigid tagging and censoring anything uncomfortable,
then what happens to critical thinking? What happens to intellectual engagement when challenging, uncomfortable ideas are successfully filtered out of all media?
What is the true cost of absolute emotional safety on a culture that needs to confront difficult truths?
Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We look forward to seeing you next time.